Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Well, that was a great panel, and I think CNN did a great job by hiring Stephen and Abinay. So our next panel is Fred Guttenberg and Amy Swearer. So for those of you who don't know Fred and Amy, I think you could turn on your cameras. So for those of you who don't know Fred and Amy is with the Heritage Foundation. She probably testifies before Congress more than anybody outside of the cabinet member. And Fred is down in South Florida. Many of you know Fred's story. Fred, you're with the Brady campaign now, is that right?
I'm an advisor to Brady now, correct.
And so what we try to do here is we try to bring people together. Sometimes it's behind the scenes, sometimes it's in front of the camera, like we're doing today. And it's a way of showing that, while people don't necessarily agree on every issue, we can talk about every issue. Because one thing we do agree on, Amy and Fred, is that there are too many deaths, and we need to try to figure out a way to reduce that. And I know, Fred, obviously you've had a terrible firsthand experience, and I know, Amy, this is a focus of yours as well. So thank you both for joining us. And I want to start off by talking about, Fred, assault weapons. So I have a feeling that you and Amy don't agree necessarily on this subject, but tell me where you are on assault weapons, and then let's hear where Amy is on that one as well.
Yeah. First, Matt, as always, good to see you, my friend, and I hope you're enjoying North Carolina.
Thank you.
And as for Amy, we've never met. I took a look at your Twitter and I saw you just got engaged. So congratulations.
Not only did she get engaged, Fred, she got engaged in Switzerland.
If you're going to get engaged, that's a good way to do it.
Go big or go home.
Listen, and Matt, you know where I stand on this. Assault weapons, after Jamie was killed, it was not a band that I went out fighting for. And the reason I didn't is because of how charged up that conversation quickly becomes. Not that in my heart, I don't think we should be doing something, but it becomes charged. And so I've always really worked hard to do more to reduce gun violence in so many other ways. I will tell you, this year, I've started to change my perspective on it a bit, and I'm going to tell you why. When Jamie was killed, again, only back in 2018, we had about 300 million weapons on the streets of America. Now we have over 400 million. And when Jamie was killed, and unlike Amy, who's a specialist when it comes to firearms, I wasn't. I was a goofy dad who had to bury a daughter. And I remember back then, everyone saying to me, these are for hunting and sport. That's what everybody said. They don't say that anymore. And now we see them showing up in the common square, at rallies. Heck, you were just with Governor Whitmer, 2 weeks ago? I mean, we all saw what happened there. And so when the nature of what people think is their right to put us at risk has changed, my perspective is shifting on it. Again, I have three metrics that I do everything by. One is, will it reduce the gun violence death rate? Number two is, will it reduce the instances of gun violence? And number three, will it reduce the severity of gun violence injuries when gun violence happens? The reason why, and you know this, Joe Walsh and I have become such really good friends, and I saw him on here earlier, is because he is a gun owner who I completely respect. And I am a guy who doesn't have any issue with gun owners. I hate gun violence, and he respects that. And we really do talk about this stuff a lot.
Thanks, Fred. Amy, when we talk about the weapon, very often when we talk to gun owners, we talk about the fact that it's about the person, right? Not necessarily the weapon. So when we talk about assault weapons, where do you stand? And I think I know, but just so the audience knows, can you talk about the difference maybe between banning a type of weapon or doing something about the person? Is that a way to phrase it? Am I phrasing that right?
Well, I mean, so there's a lot involved when we're talking about assault weapons. I know Fred and I are certainly on the same page when it comes to the metrics of absolutely wanting to reduce gun violence. And I know we could spend all day talking about the Constitution, whether or not these are protected. But I think at the end of the day, when you look at that metric alone, does this actually matter? When I look at what makes a quote assault weapon or not an assault weapon, and just how often these are or are not used in criminal activities. I look at this from a sheer policy perspective, and I question how, not how this became such a big issue. I mean, I know why it has become a big issue, but how we have sort of misstated this as like the end all be all of policy. Because I look at these weapons again from a sheer policy perspective, and I say they're not used. Yes, they have been used in some very high profile, horrific tragedies. I will never take that away from Fred.
They have.
Yes,
Trust me on that one.
yes, and nobody doubts that. But when you look at the overall grand scheme of crime, we're talking about a fraction of a percent of all gun crimes, perhaps 2 to 3% of gun homicides. And the reality becomes this question of what makes an assault weapon. We're not talking about anything that, rate of fire, caliber, anything remotely related to death metrics. And I know that's hard to consider and to think about, but we're thinking about things like barrel shrouds, collapsing stocks, pistol grips, things that in the grand scheme of deadliness of a weapon are really not hitting at the core functionalities of that gun. And so to me, I look at this and I say, you take all of that away. You take away a pistol grip, you take away a barrel shot, you take away, these characteristics that make an assault weapon. And I'm not sure we've actually done anything fundamental to change the scope of, if the same person has a non-assault weapon gun versus a quote assault weapon gun, are we actually limiting the amount of danger and the amount of deadliness that they can incur? And I look at this from a policy perspective and I say the unfortunate reality is it's not there. I don't see this from a policy perspective as being something that, especially for how charged, and I think Fred is right, this is a very charged conversation. I don't see this from a policy perspective as seeing something that fundamentally matters in terms of saving lives.
Better because it's almost like
Rima, can you mute yourself? Amy, let me ask you a question. What would be a policy? You're an expert on policy. There's no one who's a bigger expert than you on policy. Can you tell us what would be a policy change that might help, that respects Second Amendment rights, which are, we're pro Second Amendment, but which would be some type of policy change?
Sure. So I think the biggest one, if you want to look at things that are going to save lives, especially from the horrific types of tragedies that we saw that took the life of Fred's child, you look at specific targeted measures of intervention for those who are dangers to themselves or others. The reality is that when you have someone who is dangerous and given that capacity to hurt people, it doesn't matter whether or not they have a pistol grip. Right? It matters that they had a firearm in the first place. And I think talking about things like red flag laws, which I know even amongst conservatives can get very touchy. There is a measure of needing to talk about very real aspects of due process. But that all along, I think, has been the core cry of Second Amendment advocates is to say, no, we should be focusing on people who are actually dangerous and not broadly, imposing broad measures that sort of restrict or inhibit the rights of the mass of gun owners who are not dangerous. So I think that's certainly one place to start, especially when we are talking about that specific type of horrific violence that we saw at Parkland.
Yeah. Can I react?
Yeah.
Because it does matter what they use, because there is a difference in the level of deadliness. Now my daughter was on the third floor of her school, not the first. Okay. In fact, she was second to last to be shot. Of as we know, 17 killed, 17 injured. That shooter never makes it to that point, okay, without the type of weapon that he had. So it does matter. You look at what happened in Uvalde, and law enforcement literally not progressing in because they knew what the other weapon was. It does matter. It also matters for this reason. And it really, listen, I'm sure you watched the hearings that took place months ago on the assault weapons ban. And it was, oh my God, I'm having an old timers moment here from Kentucky. A Congressman, oh my God, it'll come to
Doesn't
me.
matter. Go ahead.
Republican from Kentucky, who put up a slide, and he was showing this assault weapons sales and trying to make this whole point of common use, right? And getting to the constitutional argument you just raised before. But here was the crazy thing about his slide and why it matters, and it gets to the deadliness and the increasing level of use of these weapons in deadly incidents. What he actually showed is that since Heller, we've seen the yearly manufacturing of these weapons explode. Okay, they've exploded. And so common use has actually been a business strategy of this industry. And those who support this industry now will say it doesn't matter. But it does, because my daughter is a cost of doing business for an industry that tries to suggest that that weapon doesn't make a difference. But it does. And trust me, I visit my daughter in a cemetery. And so listening to this conversation is part of the reason why I've really gone through this big shift this year, because I've tried to ignore these things. I agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to intervene when we can, where we can, before it happens. Stop a person from getting access to a weapon. But we will not always be successful. And those who intend the most harm possible, this is the weapon they're going to use. And so I'm sorry, I'm not with you in the notion that more of these on our streets makes us safer.
Fred, explain
Hey.
the orange, by the way. First, before we get to Amy, explain you're wearing orange, your background is orange. Can you just explain that?
Yeah, and it's not what people always think, because it is the color of the gun safety movement. Orange was Jamie's favorite color. And the day she was killed, my daughter was a competitive dancer. And that's why you see a photo of her dancing behind me. All of what I call her dance sisters got together with the dance studio, and they made thousands of orange ribbons that we gave out at Jamie's funeral. And at her funeral, I talked about this orange ribbons movement. Candidly, I had no idea what it was. It was just a few days after my daughter was killed, but I knew something was happening. And 3 weeks or so after, I was in a Home Depot, which again is strange in and of itself because of the color orange. And somebody in there asked me why I was wearing the orange ribbon. And when I told them, they said, you know, that's the color of the gun safety movement. And I had no idea. Again, this was never my life. This became my life. I didn't choose it. It chose me. And that day I went home and I said to my wife, we have to start a foundation. And I want to call it Orange Ribbons for Jamie. And that was the day I started reaching out. Again, I didn't know how to set up a foundation, but we have since done that. Orange Ribbons for Jamie is the foundation we set up to honor the life of my daughter and causes important to her in her life. I also set up Orange Ribbons for Gun Safety, which is the vehicle I use for advocacy. But orange was my daughter's favorite color. And I guess it's mine now also.
Thanks, Fred. Amy, you talk a lot about how to secure schools.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you think we could do better in terms of school safety? We see way too often. It's just, you know, I didn't grow up this way. You didn't grow up this way. These school shootings, how can we better secure our schools?
Yeah, if you mind, I just want to take 30 seconds because
Sure.
I think this is an important part of the conversation to talk about what I mean when I say that this difference between assault weapons. If you were to ban assault weapons, if you were to ban the specific type of firearm that shooter used, and to do so under an assault weapons ban, it would not have banned the caliber. It would not have banned the semi-automatic function of that caliber. And I think it's important to talk about that. We're not talking about banning semi-automatic rifles generally. And I know, again, I say this gently, and very much in cognizance of how devastating this was. When you take away those things that make anything an assault weapon or not an assault weapon, you still functionally have the same type of power in the same round, fired at the same rate. And so again, I say that very gently. But in terms of school safety, you know, there's again a line you want to ride here, because on the one hand, you want to be able to protect kids. You know, you want to make sure that schools or any place really are not soft targets for whether it's a school shooter or really any type of violence. But you also want to make sure that you're not turning schools into ultra hard targets where kids feel like prisoners. And I think there are ways of doing that, certainly. And I think sometimes that even just depends on having conversations within the school district itself. You know, different communities feel very differently. I'll never forget talking about with certain staffers, where in my mind, you know, the world I grew up in, I go through security all the time to go to things like concerts or to go to, you know, amusement parks. But there are other communities with very different experiences where this woman that I was talking to grew up in inner city New York. And for her, you know, to put certain security features in schools, you have kids that associate that with literally going to prison to visit family members. And it's very, very different context. And so that's why I'd say there's no one size fits all policy. And that's very, very important, that this becomes what communities are comfortable with, but that there is a tension there. There is inherently a tension. And finally, you know, just again, 30 seconds to say, when you look at the importance of even just making it harder to get into schools. I think we saw this in St. Louis, where unfortunately you did have 2 individuals lose their lives. But that shooter was delayed significantly, something like 5 or 6 minutes from getting into that school, in preventing that situation from becoming significantly worse. Now, that's just something as simple as ensuring that you can have locked doors to prevent intruders from getting in. That's even, you know, not even to get into what does armed security look like. And I think when you look at the small cost versus the high benefits of that, that's at least a starting point. Again, recognizing we want to be very clear that we're not turning schools into prison.
Fred, what are your thoughts?
No, listen, I completely agree with that notion. You know, when we're talking about school security, especially in the context of this discussion, we're talking about as it relates to stopping gun violence on school campuses. And, you know, we have to do more to keep those who intend harm from making their way onto a campus. But more important than that, we have to accept the fact that gun violence on a campus involves access to a gun from people who shouldn't have access to a gun, or possibly to the ammunition as well. And so doing something about reducing gun violence, being a gun safety activist like I am, is all about school security. Listen, I will tell you, the biggest fear that I live with in my life, and thank God it didn't come true, the shooter at my daughter's school tried to shoot through the window and into the crowd. His intention wasn't to kill 17. It was to kill a lot more. And thank God for hurricane-proof glass. The thing about school security and hardening these campuses, I worry if when that happens, a determined shooter with access to a weapon will still find the crowd. Who walks onto and off of school campuses in crowds every single day? Students. And I tell you this because typically on any given day, my son and daughter would walk from the school to the parking lot where my son would park together. I so fear a day where somebody decides that's the next target. The way to deal with this is through measures to reduce access to weapons to those who intend harm. That doesn't make me somebody who hates weapons. It doesn't make me someone who hates gun owners. In fact, I've told often, my father-in-law is a gun owner, my son goes shooting with him. I hate gun violence, and I will do anything to stop it.
Amy, so I guess the idea, Amy, is if you're able to secure the schools a bit more, right? Anything that a person sees that's preventive, could stop them from shooting in a case like this, right? That's what we're saying. Anything that interrupts that process. That's what we're saying, right?
Yeah, to an extent, and I want to be clear. I absolutely agree with Fred to the extent of hardening schools only goes so far. Anybody who says that is in and of itself the comprehensive approach, no, it's one aspect of a comprehensive approach. But I think it's certainly something that can be an important one, because what you again want to do is delay access. So sort of the physical barriers of delaying access, like we saw in St. Louis, because what that does is essentially then shorten the time that individual bent on harm has, sort of unabated, but before law enforcement or some sort of armed response can take place. But again, the preferred method would always be to ensure that we never reach that point. Again, of Parkland and all of the sort of steps along the way of intervention that would have been infinitely preferred to hurricane glass, right? Or to relying on an armed guard who unfortunately did not do his job there, right? It's you want to have all of these layers in place precisely because some of them can fail. Prevention should be preferred every time.
And we agree. And listen, in Parkland, had the armed guard done his job, people still would have died. It wouldn't have been as many. My daughter would have been one of the ones saved because she was up on the 3rd floor. So to this day, the idea that he didn't do his job is something that, as I'm sure you follow, there's been all sorts of litigation over. But because of Parkland, we did take steps in Florida under a Republican governor, a Republican House, a Republican Senate to pass really strong red flag laws to raise the age to 21. Those steps alone are saving lives. In St. Louis, had there been a red flag law in place, that shooting never would have happened. That is a complete failure of that state to copy what Florida had done. That shooting would have never happened.
You said raise the age to 21 in Florida, Fred?
For firearms purchases in Florida, it's 21. Again, a red conservative state, and we did it.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's become a red conservative state. Amy, what are the thoughts on that nationally?
Yeah, so this becomes again a question of both policy and constitutionality. And I know, again, we look at school shootings and there's this concept of, you have some individuals aged 18 to 21 who absolutely should not have had access to firearms. You also have a good number of individuals over the age of 21 who should not have access.
We agree on that.
And that's why I'd absolutely look at something like St. Louis and say, I think it was very unfortunate that the state of the law there sort of allowed this to happen. That individual, even under the law itself, should not have had a firearm. And I think that's incredibly unfortunate. And you saw the devastating effects there. The reality is the overwhelming majority of 18 to 21-year-olds who currently own firearms are absolutely law-abiding and responsible. From a constitutional standpoint, whether we want to have the conversation of whether they should be considered, full-fledged adults in every other capacity, they are in every other capacity. They are a member of the people to whom I think realistically, these are individuals who are, a lot of them living on their own, more likely statistically to be victimized by gun violence. They have every right to defend themselves. Now that said, yes, there are young adults who are not mentally mature enough. And I think that comes down to how do you specifically target those individuals instead of broadly punishing the vast majority of them who are in fact mature enough and who do routinely keep and bear arms in a respectful manner. I think this focus on age sort of loses the point, even amongst mass shooters generally. The average age, at least historically, has been something roughly around like 36. So I think this focus on age, again, from a policy standpoint specifically, I'm not sure how much it actually would affect that. And that's, again, putting aside the constitutionality of it. But I'm absolutely here for the discussion of what do we do with any young adult or older adult who is showing signs of being a danger to themselves or others. I'm cognizant of the fact that we can argue mental maturity all day, but then we'll put these same individuals on, say, jury panels. We will allow them to keep and bear arms for their countries. They can sign legally binding contracts, and I just struggle with that aspect of constitutionality to punish broadly all of these individuals for the acts of, again, a very, very small number statistically across the board of individuals who commit horrific atrocities. In my mind, age shouldn't matter. If you are showing signs of being a danger to yourselves or others, I don't care if you're 18 or 81, we should be talking about how to disarm that specific individual.
Age does matter. And just for me, it's an easy call. Under 21 shouldn't be an option. And you
Why,
use a lot of
sir?
examples
Why?
of things people can do. There's a lot of things they can't do also until they're 21. Buy a glass of alcohol, for example. Because I've seen the data and I've seen the research, and young people and their emotional ability to handle emotional situations, okay, just simply is not fully developed. And so there's a reason why in many things we do wait until they're 21. You mentioned the armed forces, and yes, they can go into the armed forces when they're 18. The armed forces are a very different situation where you have training, a controlled environment, weapons get locked up. It is not the same as the streets of America. I have no problem being as clear as possible. You should not be buying weapons until you're 21.
This is just going to be one of those areas where we fundamentally disagree. Well,
That's
again,
okay.
still acknowledging that I would assume Fred would fall on the same side of it. Doesn't matter if you're 18 or 81. If you are showing signs of being dangerous, I think we would certainly agree there.
Red flag laws to me should be the law of the land everywhere we go. So we agree on that.
Amy, when we talk about people being a harm to themselves or others, let's talk about the to themselves part of this. How do we prevent, so with the number of suicides a year, which is enormous, and the majority of deaths when a person has a gun are suicides, how do we prevent that? How do we step in and stop that more often so that there are less suicides with a gun?
Sure. So, there are several ways of looking at this. Again, everything sort of entails a holistic approach. I think one is looking at the state of the mental health infrastructure in this nation. It's pretty horrible across the board, whether we're talking about sort of intermediate options or whether we're talking about sort of crisis last resort options. We need to do a better job across the board, which again is one of those things that really gets at the heart of the issue. Yes, 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides, but only about a little over 50% of suicides involve firearms. So I think that by addressing even just that failing mental health infrastructure, we're addressing far more in terms of human flourishing. Now, in terms of
what does that mean?
What does what mean?
Human flourishing. What does that mean?
Sure. So I think sometimes and I know that this is we're talking specifically about gun policy, but a lot of the factors that sort of play into gun violence. So in this case, we're talking about suicidality. Also have factors that sort of spread outside of that. For example, the 50% of suicides that are not firearm related. That's still very bad. Those are things worth addressing. And when you get to the heart of the matter, by addressing more broadly things like our mental health infrastructure, you're addressing both the gun violence and the non-gun violence, which I think is important because sometimes this just gets it gets broader than specific discussions of gun violence. Now, in terms of what do you do besides those broad measures? Again, I think it comes down to specific targeted intervention, and then also something within the gun community itself. I think there needs to be far more discussion within the gun owning community about what we do as gun owners. The way I like to put it when I talk with people within the community is, one, to share my own experiences, And to just be blunt and honest to say, look, guys, we spend all of this time as gun owners. Why do we own guns? Right? For self-defense, to protect ourselves against the external threats, and helping them recognize that sometimes, in fact, a lot of the time, the threat is inside the house. What do we do when we or those near us start struggling? What is our mental health contingency plan? We'll mark off distances in our home in case there's an intruder. We think through when to shoot, when not to shoot. Have we thought through what we are going to do when we or someone in our household becomes the bigger threat, perhaps, than the threat outside the house? And I think that's critically important, because until you get buy-in within the gun community itself, anything that you want to do from a top-down government approach is going to be less meaningful than anything you could do from within the gun community to take control of that aspect. And it's a work in progress. I don't have some perfect, here's your 12-point answer for how you get the gun community to buy into this itself. But it's
I
at least
think
a
the
starting
community
point.
does, there is a lot of buy-in into aspects of
Mhm.
mental health and what we could do. And then, I don't know if you were on, but then Timmy O from Vera has the safe that looks like a holster, and they have a whole app on if you think that you might be a danger to yourself, not being able to use the smart technology for a certain period of time.
And I will say, so some of it is also this sense of distrust from within the gun community. There are a lot of people who own guns and are frankly a little bit scared to go and talk with their doctor about it, because they're afraid, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes for illegitimate reasons, that they'll lose their right to keep and bear arms. And I think part of this is even helping doctors understand how to talk with gun owners who might be in crisis, and to do that in good faith. I mean, some of that is just a disconnect and a lack of trust as well, that I think is undermining some of that capacity from within the gun community.
Fred, what are your thoughts on that?
No, listen, there's actually a lot of agreement here. And I think part of the way to talk to gun owners is conversations like this, like Joe Walsh and I have, to let you all know, those of us who want to reduce gun violence, we're not against gun owners. That's always been the big fallacy, the big lie that drives me nuts. But as it comes to suicide, it's true. About 2/3 of all gun-related deaths are suicide, although in the past year, that percentage of total gun violence deaths, it's actually down from 2/3. It's no longer as high as 2/3, because homicides as a percentage have gone up with more guns on the streets.
Yeah, Fred,
So,
I think Congresswoman Dean said 55% now.
it's down to 50 something. So I appreciate you saying that. Listen, that to me, when I hear people on what I call the gun lobby side or the other side say in response to every gun violence incident, mental health, it gets me annoyed, because it's not always mental health, but suicide definitely is. And we definitely as a country need a plan for dealing with suicides. We need a plan for embracing our veterans who are committing suicides at an alarmingly high rate. We need to, as a country, agree there are dangerous people who live in our homes. I'm glad you brought it up. And that there's nothing wrong with having real discussions and even legislation, if necessary, about locking weapons up, because the majority of gun violence and suicides, especially in the home, it's sometimes somebody else's gun that's used, that was left unsecured. That is, so fixable. We can do something about that, but we have to be able to talk about it. And I'm glad you mentioned the doctor as well, because I'm working with health systems around this country on developing conversations around gun violence as a public health issue, because it is. And doctors need to be able to have these conversations to identify threats in households and to talk to people about, is your weapon properly secured? Simple things like that may save lives. At the end of the day, my only mission is to save the next person. That's it. I'm not interested in the back and forth fights. I want to save lives, and I will keep on pushing forward to reduce all forms of gun violence. I saw the segment on before this.
Yeah.
In every community, in every neighborhood, on every street across America, we can and we have to do more.
Fred and Amy, Fred mentioned gun storage. So as an example, there's Ethan's Law in Connecticut. The story was that a kid went to a friend's house,
Yeah.
picked up a gun that he didn't know was loaded, pressed it, died. And now there's a law, I believe in Connecticut, that you need to lock up your gun. Amy, it's my belief that gun owners are generally speaking opposed to a law for gun storage. Is that right?
Yeah, so the general sort of pushback against this is not that, you know, we want gun owners to never be responsible. It's this sort of feeling of when you tell gun owners your guns have to always be locked up in some sort of secure storage, no questions asked, you know, no room for anything else. The question becomes, are you then inhibiting them from, you know, being able, them or other people in that household from being able to access firearms in a moment of crisis, criminal crisis, not mental health crisis, obviously, from being able to access that, and that there are in fact times when especially older teenagers who might be home alone, and there are a number of examples of this, might have to access those firearms to defend themselves or others, you know, to some extent. That you essentially don't want to criminalize the broad majority of gun owners from making what they would deem rational decisions under certain circumstances, where it's this presumption that no one ever needs to have their firearm accessible for any reason. Now, again, there's sort of this tension here, because I fully understand. You look at something like what happened in Oxford, Michigan, where at least the last time I checked, those parents are still claiming that, oh, it was in a locked drawer. But, you know, overwhelmingly, the evidence seems to point to they were giving this, you know, 15-year-old in a mental health crisis access to a firearm. You know, those are like two very polar opposite sides of that spectrum of like responsible choices. And so you then also run this risk of making the burden of having firearms more costly, right? If you tell every firearm owner, oh, you know, it's got to be in some, you know, specific type of safe, you know, are you essentially pricing certain people out of that? So there's this whole spectrum of these tensions. That said, you know, I agree. It's everyone's goal at the end of the day. Nobody looks at what happened at the underlying facts of Ethan's Law and says, oh yeah, no, that was a perfectly reasonable, rational decision to have that firearm available to that kid while he was, you know, home alone. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced, and this is sort of the pushback that most gun owners, I think, would give, is that it's not always the case that it's patently unreasonable. And that there is a range of reasonable decisions that can be made. And again, I think too, and I hope we get into this a little bit later, there is a general feeling from what I've seen amongst, you know, gun owners who tend to be sort of pushing back against any form of gun control, that it's a general lack of believing that this is in good faith, that it's not just a stepping stone to the next thing. And they see it as never being an actual compromise, you know, where there's a give and take. Now we can argue about whether that's true. Certainly it feels to a certain extent as though it is true. You know, so I would open that up for the discussion as sort of like the broad spectrum of.
We are going to open that
Pushback.
meeting for the
Yeah.
discussion, but not today because we've
Yeah.
got to go to Dr. Siegel. But I just want to say, first of all, thank you both. I appreciate you both, Amy and Fred. You know, you're both, Amy, you've been an expert on this for a long time. Fred, you didn't want to become an expert on this, but now you have. And I just want to say again, Amy, I like hearing good news. So congratulations on your good news. And Fred, thank you for doing this with us today. We have Dr. Michael Siegel from Tufts we're going to go to Dr. Siegel. So I just want to say thank you to you both. And I know I'll speak to you both soon. And thanks for your leadership on this issue.
Take
you
care,
both.
Matt. Thank you.